For nearly 2,000 years you have been told that faith is enough. Believe, obey, wait. And yet, something inside you has always known that this was incomplete. That quiet frustration you feel is not a failure of devotion. It is the residue of a knowledge that was deliberately removed. What I am about to speak of was not lost by accident. It was edited out, buried, and reframed so thoroughly that most people no longer realize it ever existed. Jesus did not only ask people to believe, he taught a small inner circle how to see, not metaphorically, not poetically, literally and perceptually. That teaching was dangerous, because a person who can see no longer depends on authority to tell them what is real. After the 4th century, when doctrine became a tool of control rather than awakening, anything resembling direct perception of truth was labelled heresy. The emphasis shifted from inner verification to external obedience. Sight was replaced with belief, experience was replaced with repetition, and the original method was quietly erased. This is why so many pray and feel nothing, why they read the words but never touch the reality behind them. You were never meant to struggle like this. You were meant to perceive. Jesus never spoke to the crowds the way he spoke to his closest disciples. To the many he gave stories, to the few he gave keys, and the first key was always the same: learn to see what others cannot. If this sounds unsettling, good, it means the memory is stirring, and if you feel drawn rather than offended, that is not coincidence, it is recognition. In 1945, a sealed jar was uncovered in the desert of Upper Egypt. Inside were texts that had been hidden for more than 16 centuries, not to preserve them, but to keep them out of sight. These writings did not describe a new Jesus. They described the one that had been systematically edited out, a teacher who spoke of awakening, of direct knowing, of perception beyond the surface of things. The danger was not what he claimed. The danger was what he enabled. Before doctrine hardened, there was a clear distinction in the language itself. Belief was never the goal. Knowing was. Knowing through direct inner contact, not through permission. When later authorities translated and standardized the message, that distinction was collapsed. What had once been experiential became symbolic, what had been practical became ceremonial, and what had been taught quietly to the ready was declared unsafe for the many. This is why certain sayings sound strange when read honestly. Blessed are your eyes, for they see. Not because they were morally superior, but because they had learned how to perceive. The kingdom of God is within you. Not as poetry, but as instruction. These lines were never meant to inspire patience. They were meant to trigger recognition. The early movements that preserved this understanding were not debated. They were eliminated, their text burned, their names erased. Not because they lacked faith, but because they removed the need for intermediaries. A person who can see does not need to be managed. Understand this clearly. What was removed was not belief in God. It was access. Access to a method that allowed the individual to verify reality from within. And once you see that pattern, you begin to understand why your own longing has never been satisfied by words alone. When Jesus spoke of eyes that see and ears that hear, he was not using metaphor to decorate a sermon. He was describing a functional difference between human beings. Some look, others perceive. And the distance between those two states is not morality, education, or worthiness. It is configuration. The crowds heard him with their ears and interpreted his words through habit, fear, and expectation. The disciples listened differently. They watched his silences. They observed where his attention rested. They noticed that when he spoke of blindness, it was rarely about damaged eyes. It was about an inner incapacity to register what was already present. This is why so many healing accounts were misunderstood. When a blind man received sight, the story was reduced to a spectacle, but the pattern is consistent if you read without conditioning. Touch, earth, breath. Command, not prayer, not supplication, not ritual permission. These were not symbolic acts. They were interventions at the level of perception. To see, in the way Jesus taught, was to bypass the surface narrative of the world. It was to perceive structure instead of appearance. Cause instead of effect, signal instead of noise. This is why he said that those who see are few, not because truth is exclusive, but because perception requires unlearning. The reason this teaching was removed becomes obvious here. A person who can see cannot be easily ruled by fear. They do not require constant reassurance. They do not confuse authority with truth. They recognize when something is imposed rather than revealed. If you have ever felt that the world operates on rules no one openly explains, that sense is not paranoia. It is the echo of a dormant faculty. Jesus did not come to replace it with belief. He came to reactivate it. And the fact that you are still listening means your eyes are already beginning to remember their function. To understand what Jesus was actually doing, you must abandon the idea that reality is fixed and solid in the way you were taught to assume. What you experience as the world is not the world itself. It is a filtered output, a narrow band selected by the nervous system to keep you functional, predictable, and manageable. This is not mysticism, it is mechanism. Human perception operates like a gate. Vast amounts of information are present at all times, but only a fraction is allowed through. Most people live their entire lives inside this restricted bandwidth and mistake it for total reality. Jesus understood this limitation intimately. He did not argue with it. He worked around it. When he spoke of the kingdom being near or within, he was not pointing to a distant realm. He was pointing to a layer of reality already intersecting the present moment, invisible only because the perceptual gate was closed. What he demonstrated to his disciples was not belief in another world, but access to this one without the usual filters. From this perspective, miracles are not violations of natural law. They are shifts in perceptual alignment. When the gate changes, the rules appear to change. Time behaves differently. Matter responds differently. The body reorganizes itself. To an external observer, this looks like magic. To someone who understands the mechanism, it is physics applied inward. This is why Jesus never credited power to himself. He consistently redirected attention back to perception. Your faith has made you whole was never about belief as hope. It was about coherence, alignment. The moment the inner state stopped resisting reality, reality responded. The authorities of the time sensed the danger immediately. A population that understands perception cannot be controlled through illusion. Fear loses its grip. Scarcity narratives collapse. The entire structure depends on people mistaking the filter for the source. What was later removed from teaching was this simple but explosive understanding. The world you experience is adjustable, not through force, but through sight, not through prayer, but through alignment. And once that is understood, obedience is no longer the foundation of spirituality. Awareness is. This is why Jesus never attempted to teach everyone the same way. Equality of access was never the issue. Readiness was. The crowd came for relief, reassurance, and spectacle. They wanted comfort without transformation, and he gave them stories, parables that could soothe without destabilizing. But to those who stayed close, who watched instead of demanded, he spoke plainly. Seeing requires a certain exhaustion, not physical, but existential. You must be tired of being managed by appearances, tired of being told what is real while sensing something underneath that never quite aligns. Most people are not there. They still want certainty without responsibility. Vision brings responsibility. The disciples were not chosen because they were holy. They were chosen because they were unsettled. They sensed the gap between what was said and what was. They were willing to lose the comfort of not knowing. That is the true threshold. This is where you must be honest with yourself. If you're still listening, it is not because this information flatters you. It does not. It destabilizes you. It removes excuses. It implies that blindness is not imposed from outside alone, but maintained from within. And yet, instead of turning away, something in you leans forward. That response is the marker, not belief, recognition. Jesus never begged anyone to follow. He observed who could tolerate proximity to truth without flinching. Those were the ones he taught, not how to worship him, but how to function as he did, quietly, precisely, without intermediaries. This is also why these teachings could not survive institutionalization. They do not scale well. They do not create dependency. They do not keep people small. A person who can see does not need to be rescued. They cannot be easily frightened into submission. They are not impressed by titles. If you feel a strange mixture of unease and clarity right now, understand this. You are not being recruited. You are being recognized. Not as special, but as ready to stop pretending that blindness is humility. The crowd looks for answers. The disciple learns to see the question dissolve. What Jesus transmitted next was never framed as a ritual, because rituals externalize power. What he showed was operational. It involved the body, attention, and a precise withdrawal from habitual interpretation. This is the part that institutions could never preserve because it cannot be owned, repeated mechanically, or enforced from the outside. He worked with matter directly. Hands on skin. Breath close enough to be felt. Earth mixed with saliva and applied to the eyes. Silence held longer than comfort allows. These were not symbolic gestures meant to impress. They were methods to interrupt the automatic loop of perception. The nervous system was the entry point, not belief. When attention is forced to slow, when the body is brought into a specific stillness, the internal noise begins to collapse. Thought loosens its grip. The constant labeling of experience weakens. In that moment, perception opens, not upward, not outward, but inward through the surface of things. This is why his commands were simple and immediate. Stand, see, stretch, go. No time for doubt to rebuild the filter. Understand this clearly. He did not ask permission from a higher authority before acting. He did not invoke names or formulas. He did not wait for faith to accumulate. He assumed access. And that assumption alone reorganized the field around him. Those who were present and receptive were pulled into coherence with it. This is what later teaching could not allow. If access is immediate, authority dissolves. If the body is the interface, salvation cannot be delayed or sold. If perception is adjustable, fear-based control fails. What remains in the official story is the outcome without the mechanism, the effect without the cause, miracles without method, and so people are left to admire what they were meant to learn. The truth is simpler and more demanding. Nothing is missing, no external power needs to arrive. The obstruction is internal, habitual, reinforced since childhood. Jesus did not come to remove it for everyone. He came to demonstrate that it could be removed. And once you understand that, the question is no longer whether this works. The question becomes whether you're willing to stop hiding behind mystery and allow perception to change you at the level where excuses no longer survive. This is the threshold where seeing stops being an idea and becomes a function. What follows was never presented as a technique you memorize. It was shown as a state you enter. That distinction matters because the mind will try to imitate what it cannot control. Jesus bypassed the mind entirely. He worked below it at the level where perception is assembled before language arrives. The first shift is physical, not mystical. The body must become still enough that it stops narrating itself, not rigid, not posed, simply settled, weight dropping downward, breath no longer forced or guided, just allowed to fall into its own rhythm. When the body stops signaling urgency, the nervous system releases its grip on the familiar filter. Then comes the withdrawal of interpretation. You do not close your eyes to escape the world. You keep them open and stop naming what you see. The moment you label, the old structure reasserts itself. Instead, you allow shapes, movement, and depth to register without commentary. This feels uncomfortable at first. The mind will reach for meaning like a reflex. You let it fail. As that reflex weakens, something subtle happens. Space deepens. Objects lose their assumed solidity. Not because they dissolve, but because you are no longer compressing them into concepts. This is the doorway Jesus guided his disciples toward. Not trance, not imagination, direct perception without compression. At this point, many stop. They feel exposed. The familiar sense of self begins to thin, and fear arises. This is why the crowd was never taught this. Fear feels like danger when identity is attached to the filter. But if you remain still, the fear passes. What replaces it is not ecstasy, but clarity. In that clarity, reality feels responsive. Not obedient, not magical, but coherent. You notice that attention itself is a force. Where it rests, structure organizes. This is why commands worked. They were not wishes. They were issued from alignment when there was no internal contradiction. Do not try to control what appears. That returns you to effort. Simply remain without interpretation long enough for perception to reconfigure itself. This is not something you achieve. It is something that happens when interference stops. Jesus did not promise comfort here. He promised truth. And truth is experienced as a stripping away before it becomes freedom. If you have reached this point and feel both unsettled and awake, Understand that this is correct. You're no longer rehearsing ideas. You're interrupting a lifelong pattern. Seeing begins the moment you stop trying to see and allow the filter to collapse under its own weight. This is where the danger begins, and this is why what you're hearing was never meant to be widespread. Once perception shifts, even slightly, you can no longer unsee what structures reality is built upon. You begin to notice how much of the world depends on unconscious agreement, how fear is maintained through repetition, how authority survives only as long as it remains unquestioned. This is not rebellion, it is clarity, and clarity destabilizes systems that rely on confusion to function. Those who begin to see do not become violent or chaotic. They become difficult to manipulate. They stop responding predictably to threats and promises. They no longer confuse symbols with substance. This is why every civilization that centralized spiritual authority eventually suppressed direct perception, not because it was false, but because it was uncontrollable. Understand the pattern. First, experience is labeled dangerous. Then it is replaced with doctrine. Doctrine is repeated until familiarity masquerades as truth. Over time, people forget that another way of knowing ever existed. By the time control is complete, obedience feels virtuous and blindness feels normal. This is the prison you were born into, not made of walls but of assumptions, not enforced by guards but by habits of thought, and it works only because most never realize it is there. When Jesus spoke of freedom, this is what he meant, not moral permission, perceptual liberation. The ability to stand inside reality without intermediaries, without filters imposed by fear, tradition, or reward. That kind of freedom cannot be granted. It can only be reclaimed. This is also why awakening is quiet. There are no banners, no mass movements. Those who see recognize one another without needing to declare it. They move differently. They listen differently. They do not argue to convince. They wait. If something in you feels both expanded and exposed right now, that is not a warning to stop. It is a signal that an old agreement is loosening. The discomfort is not danger. It is the sensation of stepping outside a structure that once defined you. The institutions that survived did so by convincing people that this discomfort was sin, pride, or deception. But it is none of those. It is transition. You're not leaving reality. You're entering it without the filter that kept you manageable. And once that process begins, there is no returning to sleep. Only a choice about how honestly you will live with what you now perceive. What you're encountering now is not a conclusion. It is a recognition. The ability to see was never taken from humanity. It was set aside, covered, and renamed until it felt foreign. But nothing that is truly part of you can be erased. It can only be forgotten. Jesus did not come to be admired. He came to be understood, not intellectually but operationally. He demonstrated what a human being looks like when perception is no longer outsourced, when reality is met directly without fear-based filters. That state was never meant to belong to one figure in history. It was meant to be transferable. This is why he said that those who follow would do what he did, and more, not as a promise of power, but as a statement of capacity. When perception is clear, action becomes precise. Life stops feeling like a negotiation with an invisible force, and starts responding like a coherent field. If you have listened this far, do not pretend it was curiosity alone. Curiosity fades, recognition does not. Something in you has already crossed the threshold from belief to remembrance. You may not know how to articulate it yet, but you feel the shift. The old explanations no longer satisfy. The old fears no longer fully convince. This is the moment where most people retreat into distraction. Not because the path is unclear, but because it is clear enough to demand honesty. Seeing removes excuses. It dissolves the comfort of blaming external powers for an internal blindness that is no longer sustainable. I am not asking you to agree with me. Agreement is irrelevant. I am asking you to decide whether you are willing to live as someone who sees, even when it is inconvenient, even when it separates you from the sleep of the many. If you are ready, mark it. Not for me, but for yourself. Leave a simple statement of commitment. Not belief, commitment. Say that you are willing to see, even if it changes you. This is how those who recognize one another begin to gather, quietly, without symbols, without hierarchy, not as followers, but as witnesses. What was hidden has done its work the moment it is remembered.